The legend, Jack Herney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
It's such an honor to have you. It's such a pleasure to see you again. I think all of us owe you a huge debt of gratitude because it was your signature on most of our letters of acceptance to Exeter back in the day.
That was correct. You guys were about my final class as director of admissions, and none better than that one.
Well, I want to say thank you for that if I haven't before. and it was a tremendous experience, I think, for all of us and certainly for me. The goal of this today is to just have a chat and talk. I think since a lot of us have turned 50, it was a moment to take a look back and just sort of reflect a little bit on some of the things that have happened in our lives. One thing that wells up for a bunch of us is a sense of gratitude for Exeter and for people like yourself that have touched our lives. So again, thank you for that. And you are a huge favorite of so many of my classmates. And I regret I didn't get to have your history class. I always remember, though, the warmth walking into what's now called Bissell House, the admissions office, after having gotten my acceptance, and how warm you were and how welcoming and kind you were. It's just such a great thing to see you here and to have you back. And, again, thank you so much for all of that.
And again, happy to be with you and delighted to be talking about through Facebook's grade books, pictures, which has been great fun. So, and I might just say now that just so you know the import of your class, I was your class advisor, not that the class advisor ever did very much, but maybe as a result of that, I was given this, which is your class picture. And when I retired, I taught every spring, and I had this in my class in the basement of the Academy building with the big round table, put it on the wall. So that was my class. But then when I taught in the spring, I move around the classrooms, and I would take that with me, and I would put it on whatever bulletin board was in the class. So there was always the class of 92 with me as I have been teaching ever since you left the school. And also, I don't know if any of you remember, but the development office wanted to do a brochure for the Parents Fund. So they sent a photographer over to the 331 class, the H format, which produced this, which has 4 of the illustrious members of the class sitting around that table. And then this on the front. They took a whole bunch of pictures, but Brandon, Kate, Jerry, and Haven were the ones who got their pics on it. Yeah. This was also on my bulletin board. So just a way of saying that you've always stayed with me, even though you left.
Well, that's amazing. I think that's an honor. You said to me after I emailed you, because I had emailed you, Mr. Herney, would you be interested in coming onto this new thing that we're doing, this Class of 92 podcast that we're doing? It's a big experiment. We're just trying it out. We're thinking about, just having people on from the class and, folks like yourself that are important to us. And then you wrote me back and you said, listen, it's Jack. I know it's weird, but get used to it.
You just have to keep repeating it. We'll get over that. I mean, I've had students who are classes of 70 something still, when they write a letter, say, Mr. Herney. I said, no. Just practice. It's Jack. Just say it over and over again.
So you were such an incredible part of Exeter lore, Jack, and you probably know this. And I think, for generations of students across Exeter history, you've figured quite prominently. And so I think what I would like to begin with today is if you can just take us back to the earliest part of your life and just tell us a little bit about yourself. And where are you from? Who is Jack Herney? I made the mistake of thinking, because you were so well integrated into the fabric of Exeter community and culture and story making, that I just assumed you were also an Exonian from being a student, at which you corrected me that you were not a student at Exeter. But when you corrected me, you began telling me a little bit about your origins. I'd love for you to take us all back to the beginning. So who is Jack Herney? Where is Jack Herney from?
Sure. Well, I think even when the class of 92 was in my class, the first day, we would go around and I'd say, I want to know what your hometown is and a couple of other questions, what you look forward to in this course or something. And I'll start. And I always started with, I'm from Homer, New York. And so most people know that I'm from Homer because I insisted on beginning every class with that. I think I did it back in the 90s too. So there, yeah, Homer's in upstate New York. It's this tiny little town. I always felt sorry for the kids in Cortland, which was Homer was sort of a suburb, about 3,000, 3,500 people. Cortland was about 15,000, 20,000. In those days, it had some industry and so on. And it had a gentry that sent some of their kids to prep schools. And I always felt sorry for them that they're being sent away. Isn't that too bad? I had a wonderful high school career, not despite the fact that my father was the high school principal, so I had to behave and be a good kid. But I had a wonderful experience at the Homer Central High School. And I always felt sorry for kids who went away. Well, then I went to Dartmouth and then Harvard. And I decided to teach. For some reason, well, I think it became because I met so many kids at Dartmouth who had been to prep schools, including Exeter. There were two kids in my fraternity, two guys who were both class of 60 at Exeter. And I knew them very, very well. Actually, they weren't the only ones. I think there were about 5 in my fraternity that were from Exeter. So I decided to look at boarding schools, and I went to a little school called Wilbraham for a year. And out of the blue, got a call from Exeter and said, you're teaching, we have an opening at Exeter. Would you be interested? And I said, well, I'll go up and take a look at it. And I planned at this point to go on to graduate school, do more graduate school, even though I'd already done some. So I drove up and sat in and saw a class and saw, wow, this is not where I come from, and not like the school I was in. So I decided, well, I'm going to go to Exeter for a year or two. When I got there, said, by the way, why did this phone call was out of the blue? How did that happen? And Ted Bedford, the chair of the department at the time, said, well, when we have an opening, this is the old days, the bad old days in some way, because it's the old boy network. They said, we call Yale and Harvard and ask their history departments, who's a recent graduate and that's teaching. And that's where we got your name. And I said, okay, fine. Well, anyway, after a year of the classes there, I have to tell you, it was the hardest year because I remember I would go to bed I would read and read and read and go to bed at 2 or 3 in the morning, get up at 6 and to be sure I was able in the classroom enough. But I loved it. And I decided to stay. And then Susan taught in the summer school actually before I did. And I met her one summer in about 70. And we started dating. And then she went to graduate school at UNH. So we were dating all through the 70s. So that was another reason to stay. So that's how it all began. And then I actually did leave Exeter. I resigned in 76 to work on the Hill for Senator McIntyre from New Hampshire, which I did for 2 years. He fortunately, in some ways, lost the election in 78. And Susan, we were getting married. And I thought, well, Susan will come down to Washington. But then I got another phone call from Exeter. They said, would you come back and help us raise money for the Third Century Fund? So I did, and then became director of admissions the next year and stayed thereafter. And we've been absolutely delighted being here all those years. It's been fabulous. And for a person who, I have to tell you, the history department back then was terrific. There were so many sort of legends in secondary school history teaching on our faculty. Henry Bragdon, who you wouldn't have known, but he taught in the classroom next to me. He wrote a book called The History of a Free People, which is the largest selling history textbook in America. And here this guy was in the classroom next to me, and we became great friends, and he retired shortly thereafter. But it was full of Don Cole, written tons of books about Jacksonian democracy. So it was enormously stimulating. When I left the classroom, I would go up to the department room, and there would be three or four guys who also didn't have a class that time, and we'd talk history. I was thinking I was going to go back to graduate school. I said, why? I can learn more history here than I can, or as much, or if not more than, plus I get to teach as well. So the heck with graduate school. So I stayed.
Incredible. Incredible. What made you want to become a teacher? And then also, what about the discipline of history pulled you in?
My father had been a teacher and then was an administrator. As I said, was principal. My mother was a teacher. My brother was a teacher. I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and I took a law course at Dartmouth and didn't much care for it, but I loved history, and I did very well in it. And I had a teacher, this may speak to some of the class, but if you have one teacher who makes a huge impression, and I had one at Dartmouth, I had him twice, and he left Dartmouth, and he was the reason that I moved to Washington and worked on the Hill, because he became the administrative assistant to Senator McIntyre, and he hired me. But I had a fabulous experience in the classroom at Dartmouth with this guy in particular, but other teachers as well. So I said, well, I want to read history, and the way to read history is to teach it. So that's sort of why.
And was it American history specifically?
Yeah, they had a senior seminar. There were just 10 of us in the class, my fall term, and it was on the progressive period. And there were 10 of us, 2 from each of 5 different fraternities. And we thought this guy was a fairly new teacher out of Yale. And we thought, well, we'll take this. He won't know much about, assigning too much work or something. Well, his syllabus, the first assignment was this long in readings. And he said, now, I want you to read among all these other readings, the first 250 pages of The Age of Reform by Hofstadter. And in there, he talks about what a progressive is. And then he walked in the first day holding a stack of books that was up to here, and he dumped them on the table. He said, here are 10 biographies of quote-unquote progressives. And after you read, this is on a Tuesday, after you read the 250 pages of The Age of Reform, plus this other stuff, then pick one of these biographies and read the biography, and then read a 4-page paper on why or why not this guy fits what Hofstadter says about progressives. What? In 3 days, we're going to do this?
Yeah.
But it was fabulous. And every class was this enormous list of readings, but it was dynamite. And so I became so enamored with the progressive period that about the 3rd year I was at the academy, we had a guy named Moynihan, Tim Moynihan, who was Daniel Patrick Moynihan's son. He was a student. Moynihan was the United States Senator from New York and was a huge political guy in Washington. And Tim Moynihan was a character. He would enter the room where the student council met through the window, not the door. Why? But that was Tim Moynihan. But he also did drawings. They had one of me in the yearbook, the peon, holding a teddy bear and looking like Teddy Roosevelt, because I talked about Teddy Roosevelt a lot, and because he was sort of my champion as a political figure in those days. So it was American history. I did teach European courses, and in fact, come to think about it, when they called me up to the interview at Exeter, one of the reasons they did was they heard I was teaching a course on Nazi Germany, European history in the 20th century, and they wanted to change the European course at Exeter to figure more about the from the French Revolution on. And they said, what are you teaching? And I described my syllabus, and that's exactly what they wanted. So from the time I came here, everybody taught American history, but I was teaching the European history course as well, which was a senior course at the time, and then it moved back into the lower year.
Did you know what you were getting into when you took this job? So I think you said before you were at Wilbraham, which is a different prep school in Western Mass.
Yes, a very small prep school. It was a good school. I enjoyed the kids. It was challenging, but the difference was what I talked about the department room. I mean, there were, I think, 3, maybe 4, 3 history teachers, I think. Here there were a dozen. highly professional. They'd written books, or as I said, it was like going to a seminar every time you walked into the department room. So it was, and the students, of course, were just, they read more and wrote better and were more challenging for me too. So that made a huge difference. It was a different professional experience.
Yeah. But did you know what you were getting into as a faculty person beyond just the teaching aspect?
Well, that's an interesting question because I didn't know anything about much about Exeter except by reputation, obviously, that it was a great school. But why? Well, they had good students and good faculty. I didn't understand what it was, that it was supposedly a quote unquote faculty run school. The school I had come from was very top down. The headmaster made all the decisions and so on. And one of the enticing things once I got here was that the faculty is supposed to do a lot beyond teaching. They're supposed to, in effect, run the school. And I'll give you one example. In the early days, in the 70s, it was tumultuous because of the Vietnam War and everything else. And when Kent State not broke out, when Kent State happened, the assembly that morning, the person who was supposed to speak was an outsider. He was brought by the religion department, and he began by saying, I can't give my talk. We have to deal with what's happened to these students. Whereupon it became, in those days, it was about 800 students, a conversation about what to do. And I remember I spoke, I can't remember how I had the courage to do it, to the whole group briefly about, oh, we have this thing called the classroom. We should be talking about this in the classroom. Well, after this, they said, should the school strike? And a lot of schools were going on strike and so on. They said, no, what we're going to do is have a steering committee to decide what we're going to do. And it's going to be made up of faculty and students, not administrators. I was one of the people on the committee. Don Cole was the chair. He was the chair of the history department. And there were about 6 faculty and 4 or 5 students. And we met to decide how the school was going to respond to the Kent State thing. So that was a whole different idea of how a school ought to operate. And every administrative position in those days was taken by a faculty member. The dean of faculty moved up from the dean. I eventually became the dean of faculty. Director of admissions was a faculty member. All the administrative positions were faculty. So you were expected not only to teach, but at some point, many of us become administrators and run the school with other faculty. So that form of governance was very attractive and very different.
Right. Is that how they recruited you? Did they pitch you on coming to work at Exeter?
No, I think it was again that course I was teaching, and I was using texts that they had heard of. Steve Smith was teaching the course. I don't know if he was still here when you were here, but
I remember
great.
I had him as a teacher, yeah.
Yeah. And Steve looked at my syllabus and said, this is what I want on my syllabus too. So there was an immediate partnership there. So I was hired, I think, really because of they looked at my resume and my grades, but they also looked at my syllabus and said, he's teaching the kind of stuff we want our kids to learn.
Right, right. So you were a young man then, right? In your mid-20s or so?
Yeah, 24, I think.
Wow. So this was 1968, right? When you came?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Amazing. When you came to Exeter, did they assign you to live in a dorm?
Yes.
Which one?
Yeah. Now, this is so I come to Dunbar Hall. We were all boys, of course.
Of course.
And I go to the 3rd floor and I walk all the way to the end of the corridor on the 3rd floor, and that's my apartment. So no private entrance. You walk in up 3 floors all the way down at the end. I walk in and there's a hallway and there's a door on the right-hand side. There is a room there, which turned out to be my bedroom and study. Straight ahead is a door. Before I went in there, there was another door which went into a very nice room with a fireplace, and it was a corner room, so it had windows on 2 sides. That was the living room with a fireplace. That's nice. Then I opened the other door. The other door on the left-hand side was a tub and a sink and a toilet. On the other side of the room was a hot plate and a little stove and refrigerator. So my bathroom was the same as my kitchen.
Sounds deluxe.
Yeah, and I went to the dean and I said, "Really? Is this what?" And they said, "Well, yeah, we're still working on this sort of thing." Anyway, that was my first. Now, also interesting these days is 2 doors down from me was a new lower by the name of William K. Rawson, the current principal of the academy.
No.
So Bill and I go way back. We were both newbies in the fall of 1968. He is a lower and me as a young teacher.
Wow. What
Yeah.
was he like?
What's that?
What was he like as a student?
Uh, as a lower, he was shy, bashful, like most people, terrified, and he'll tell you that. Wasn't sure whether he belonged, and so on. By the time he was a senior, he became a proctor. There were five proctors in the dorm. His great pals is George Calicman, who I had in class. George and I have stayed very, very close friends. I taught his son, who graduated in 2019, Will. And in fact, Will is named for Bill Rawson.
Amazing.
It's William K. Rawson, and Will Calicman is named for Bill Rawson. So the three of us have stayed very, very close, particularly George and myself. But by the time he was a senior, they had something called the Dunbar Shuffle, which halfway through the year they were told to leave because they were redoing the dorm to make it into a girls' dorm. Bill has in Saltonstall House, the principal's house, now when you walk in, a picture on your left, which is the entire dorm of boys protesting the fact they have to, and they're going to be sent all over campus to live in other dormitories. And Bill and the five proctors are sitting in the balcony of Dunbar Hall looking down, sort of leading the protests and stuff. But it was great.
So interesting. So did they scatter those boys across lots of different dorms, or did they try
Yeah,
to put them
yeah.
together?
There would be five here, six here. The largest group went to Peabody. I don't know why, but there were about 18 of them that went there, but the rest were just scattered wherever there were rooms and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. My goodness. So Jack, you are an Exeter encyclopedia. I am so interested and curious about your over 5 decade perspective now, going back to 68. So you're talking about you were there for 2 years before coeducation, right? Did it start in 1970?
The Day Girls in 1970,
Okay, so when were the first boarding girls?
71.
I
And
see.
then they thought the prep girls are probably too young to come, so we'll only have lowers, uppers, and seniors, no prep girls. Stupidly, since as we all know, ninth grade girls are more mature than ninth grade boys. But
Of course, in every way,
yeah,
yes.
but so that didn't last very long. But yeah, that's how it worked.
So describe what Exeter was like in that late 60s, early 70s period.
Well, as I said, the particularly 70, 71, and 72, there were two significant issues going on. One was the war. The previous year to the Kent State situation, which was in 70, there was a national moratorium. You obviously weren't born then, it wouldn't know about it, but if you read some history, that supposedly all over the country on October 15th, I think it was, there was supposed to be protests. And there was at Exeter. And 450 students marched from the academy. There was something in town. Then we marched all the way to Shaw's Hill. You remember Shaw's Hill?
I do.
Some of you might have run up it.
Oh, yes, I have
Okay.
several
Well, on the
hundreds of
side
times.
of Shaw's Hill, the art department had built a wooden god of Mars, and 450 students and faculty walked out. There were the ministers of Phillips Church said some things, there were some speeches, and then they burned the god of Mars. And then we silently walked back to the academy. So there was turmoil about the war. I mentioned the thing about the Kent State and the thought that there would be a student strike and so on. What that committee wound up doing was saying, actually, that was, I think, on a Tuesday. And at the end of the week, there were going to be 2 days of teach ins where classes were voluntary, even. Can you imagine? So it was turmoil. The other thing was drugs, and marijuana was creeping in, and then worse stuff. In 73, '73, I guess it was, been moved from Dunbar to run McConnell or half of McConnell when Don Dunbar went on a sabbatical. So I took over that dorm. Then I moved to Seoul. Then I guess I was at '72, I moved to Seoul. And '71, I moved to Seoul. And they moved the three people who were in there out. One was retiring, one was on sabbatical, and the third they just wanted to get rid of because everybody knew that Soul Hall was the center of the drug market on campus.
Goodness, really?
So they brought three of us in, myself, Dan Morrissey, who was the school minister, and Dick Hall, who was also a bachelor at that time. I was a bachelor. And the students knew why we were there. We were supposed to clean up the dorm. And it was a tough adjustment, I'll tell you. When we were on our beach trip at the first weekend of the fall, when we'd met the kids for a week and so on, Dick and Dan and I were walking down the beach, and the kids were out there. And Dick said, "You know, I met friendlier people on a New York subway than I have in that dormitory." Because there was not every kid was doing drugs, but there was enough of it. So I remember walking back. I left the dorm and went over to Wetherill for breakfast and came back. And I noticed at the base of Soul Hall was a mattress that was smoking. What? Where did that come from? It had been tossed out of a fourth store window because the kids had been smoking and caught the thing on fire and just dumped it out the window. Yeah,
Right.
and so it was very challenging, and though the faculty and the students were like this, the students wanted more freedom. There was one assembly when the principal had fired the editor of the Exonian for an article that appeared, and he came on. This is Dick Day. Came on the stage and said, announced that Will Hunter was being fired, and then he said, "Senior class." Whereupon Mark Finn, a member of the senior class, jumped on the stage and said, "We're not going anywhere. Don't move. We're going to protest this." So there was this long assembly where students set up and said, "We're going to strike. The teachers can't do this. The principal can't do this," and blah blah blah. There was a young woman, a woman by the name of Jane Scarborough, who had been in my class, observing the class because she was applying for a job. And after the class, I had taken her to assembly. So we're sitting there and watching this, you know, unfold in front of us with kids screaming, yelling, and denouncing the faculty. And one kid who had been quoted in the article as calling another faculty member an idiot or something, which he stood up in tears and said, "This is all my fault." And he ran out. Whereupon Jane Scarborough leaned over to him and said, "You didn't really have to plan all this for me." So, but the tension between students and faculty was considerable. It had to do with the war, it had to do with drugs, it had to do with the times where kids wanted greater freedom. The head of the student council, David Krieger, in '72, made his resolution to disband the student council because it didn't have enough power. I was the advisor of the student council at the time. Oh my God. Fortunately, he was voted down and he quit. And that's when Bobby Thompson became head of the student council. But that's the kind of it in my 50 years since. I still consider myself part of it because I still teach every spring almost. Um, the whole thing has changed significantly. In fact, Steve Kurtz was brought in the mid '70s to warm up the school. There was thought there was too much. The big phrase is Exeter is not a warm nest. That's on the back of the assembly hall. A wonderful statement by Ernie Gillespie, who was an interim principal before Dick Day, and addressed to the students. One of his phrases was, "Though Exeter is not a warm nest." There's more to the quote. I don't know if you know it. It's absolutely wonderful. He talks about coming back and um, showing your bruises and try to strike a few blows for civilization and um, come back and show us your scars. We should be good to see you. We should be glad to see you. Something like that. But before that, he says that Exeter is known as not a warm nest, and so they brought Steve Kurtz in to warm it up in the set.
I see. I see. So your first principal was Dick Day then?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So you have a perspective going back all the way to Dick Day to Principal Kurtz to I think then Principal O'Donnell came. Right. Okay. And then after that, that would have been
Ty
Tingley.
Tingley.
And then after that,
Tom
Hassan.
Hassan,
Okay. And then after that,
Lisa uh, McFarland, and now Bill.
now Bill. Beautiful. Wow. Incredible. So as you think through the generations, it sounds like the late 60s, early 70s, which is pretty consistent with what I think of, that generation or that time in American history as being one of turmoil. When was sort of the next inflection point after that?
Well, I think it sort of oozed into another era. I think Steve did a remarkable job. He had a wonderful way of speaking to the kids, speaking to the students. I remember at one time, I can't remember the incident, but his message was, "You're better than that." And you could tell from the reaction of the students, they said, "Yep, he's right." I can't remember what had happened, but he had a way of speaking to the students that was better than just about any principal I've known. That was very helpful. Uh, the growth of coeducation was enormously influential in changing the tone of the school because now boys had more to think about than protest. They had who's going to be my date at such and such a thing or that sort of thing. So that was enormously helpful. The impact of coeducation is next to Harkness, clearly the most important thing that happened to the school in the 21st century. I mean, 20th century, and maybe in the whole history of the school. The two big inflection points were Harkness and coeducation. So that, I think, softened the school significantly. And Kendra O'Donnell was brought in to do more of that. And I think she did. And I think it's continued. Think about this. In the 70s, we instituted early graduation. So you could graduate in January. And it was very popular because people wanted to get out of here. By your time and certainly thereafter, nobody wants to leave in the spring term of their senior year. It's the best. Everybody looks forward to that. It became a real issue for the Washington intern program because nobody wanted to even go to Washington. They wanted to stay on campus and take those great courses that were now offered spring term and blah, blah, blah. So it's so different in terms of the connectivity between the students and the faculty now than it was in the early 70s.
After I got the acceptance letter from you, and I remember hearing about it from my dad, I was off on some violin orchestra kind of adventure that weekend with my eighth grade class, and I came back and he smiled and he just gave me the letter, and I was like, wow, oh my God, and I just remember being really excited, and I just knew at that moment in my life everything was going to be different, and I was so happy and so excited about it. And so between the time you sent those letters out, which were somewhere around March 15th, I think, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay, good. Yeah, 1988. So then I remember sort of the next 6 months was some sort of preparation for showing up at Exeter. One of the things that I would do is I would go to the library and I would go into the microfiche library and I would just pull up Exeter stuff on the microfiche to find out what was this thing, what was this place that I was about to go to. I had zero idea about what Exeter meant in terms of being an elite institution in American history. I had no idea that had been the case. I had some inkling of it, but the depth of which it was sort of tied to American colonial history, or that this set of very prolific alums had come and gone through, and so on. I just had no idea. And I pulled up an article about the appointment of Kendra O'Donnell as principal, and it was like a big deal because, as the headline said, a woman at Old Exeter. And that struck me. And I said, okay, I get it. I think I see what's happening here. There's this old boys' school, kind of old boys network, institutional kind of place where what I understood at the time in the 30s, 40s, 50s, you just got an index card and then you checked between Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and then off you went from Exeter to one of those three places. And maybe that was true, maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But this idea of Old Exeter, though, really was conjured in my mind. So when you came in the late 60s and early 70s, was there any touch still of Old Exeter? And is that what Exeter was like from what you understand?
Well, yeah. I mean, as I said, the think about how I was hired. It was the old boy network, and it was more the old than the new. It had not turned the page from in so many ways that it was always like. I think when I came those first years, 60 some kids went to Harvard, 20 some, five maybe to Yale, 15 each to Dartmouth and Princeton. Virtually, two-thirds of the school went to Ivy League schools. You go back, and it was clear that if you were at Exeter, you would go to Harvard in the 18th century. That was simply a given. In fact, if you want a little Exeter history to go way back, the early teachers, there's only one, and then there were three maybe, and they would bring up, Harvard would send somebody up as a tutor. And starting from the very beginning, there was that connection between the two. Here's a story that I'm sure you don't know, and I didn't know this. Daniel Webster, 1796, is at the school. And he writes home to his father about how difficult it is. And the most difficult class he has is in declamation. The man who would become the greatest orator of the 19th century. He says, I'm terrified to stand up. But there is this one teacher whose name is, it's not Birmingham, it's going to come to me, who was so nice to me. This is Daniel Webster. He's 14 years old. This guy he's talking about is 12 years old, and he's teaching at Exeter.
Okay, wow.
And he is because he was going to go to Harvard, and Harvard said, no, not yet. Go to Exeter and teach for a year, and then you can come to Harvard. That was how close the connection was.
Interesting.
This guy, by the way, wound up starting the Boston Athenaeum. Absolutely fascinating guy. But there was that enormous connection, and there still was in the late 60s. It was very much that way. We got our faculty from the Ivies. The kids went to the Ivies. It was, and the other thing was that talk about the old days, we had one person in the early 70s, one person in the college counseling office. And it wasn't called college counseling, it was called college placement. Mm-hmm. And he wouldn't go to Harvard or Hanover to Dartmouth. They would come to Exeter from the admissions offices at Harvard, Yale, all come to Exeter to say, okay, who you got?
Wow.
Yeah. And if this is well into the mid 70s, if the director of college placement called and said, you really got to take this kid, it would happen.
Is that right? That's right. So it's a feeder school, and there's this entire history, and then we have Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son, and many, many, many other people in American history kind of coming through. I'm super fascinated by this, so if you'll indulge me for a minute, I was also a history major in college as well, so I love history also. There's so many things I want to get to, but if you would indulge us for a minute, what are the best sort of pre-1968 Exeter sort of historical moments that come to mind?
Well, a couple, and I'll just give you a couple. You mentioned Robert Todd Lincoln. I just gave a talk yesterday at Riverwoods in Durham. Riverwoods is a retirement community. It started in Exeter, and there's now a branch in Durham. Started by Exeter faculty, actually, in the late 70s, I think. A lot of Exeter faculty retired there. It's hugely successful. And I gave a talk on, it was February 12th, so guess what I talked about? Abraham Lincoln. I wore my Abraham Lincoln socks. Which I showed right at the beginning, that I was in uniform.
Okay.
And I mentioned that Abraham Lincoln, when he sent his son to Exeter on the advice of Amos Tuck, a very famous Exeter name and Hanover name, the Amos Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth, because Lincoln wanted his son to go to Harvard or some very good school. And he took exams at Harvard, and he failed 14 of the 15 exams to get into Harvard. And Amos Tuck said, well, I think if you go to Exeter for a year, you can probably get into Harvard. So Lincoln sends his son to Harvard. And he writes him and he says he's going to visit him. But he has to get money from winning this case. He doesn't get the money. But he gets an invitation to give a speech at Cooper Union in New York in February of 1860. He's not a candidate for president at the time. So he writes his son and says, I'm coming. I've got money. And when I give the speech, I'll come to you at Exeter. He gives the speech. It's enormously successful. You ever heard of the Cooper Union speech?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, it's arguably, some have said, it is the most important speech in the American political and constitutional history. The most important speech in American constitutional and political history. The reason is, after he gives the speech, which is an hour and a half, and it's very well received, he goes to Exeter. But does he? No, because immediately after he's given the speech, the Republicans in Providence say, would you please come and give a speech on your way up to Exeter? So he stops in Providence and gives a speech. He gets to Exeter. He's now got 4 invitations to speak in New Hampshire. So he takes Robert from Exeter to Concord to give a speech the next day, then to Manchester that night to give the next day. Then he comes back through Exeter, drops Robert off, goes to Dover to give a speech. Then he goes to Exeter and he spends 3 days with Robert and he gives a speech at the Exeter Town Hall. And there's a big plaque about that. Then does he go home? No, because by then Republicans all over New England have heard about the Cooper Union speech and they know he's still here. So he speaks in Hartford, Woonsocket, Bridgeport, and 2 or 3 other towns in Rhode Island and Connecticut, and finally gets home. That's in February and March of 1860. In the convention, and this is what my talk was about, in the convention in May in Chicago, surprisingly, Seward does not sweep New England like he was supposed to. He only gets something like 23 or 33 votes out of all the delegates. On the second ballot, Lincoln gets more than Seward. Where? New Hampshire, Connecticut, Vermont, and Rhode Island, where he has spoken. And then on the third ballot, he wins the election. So, as I said, and I've told this to Exeter class assemblies, Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States because his son went to Exeter.
Neat. That's really neat. Yeah.
Now, that's only apocryphal because there's lots of things that went on in the U of Chicago. But clearly, that visit to Exeter in the 19th century by Abraham Lincoln to visit his son was hugely important in American history. It may not be the only reason he was nominated, but it certainly contributed to the nomination of Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
The other would be a 20th century one, and that was the emergence of William Boyce Thompson. In fact, it was said of him by Lewis Perry, the principal for 40 years, that William Boyce Thompson brought us the second founding of the school. And the reason he did was money, because when you were here, there was the Thompson Science Building, the Thompson Gym, the Thompson Field House. He gave much more. He came to the school in the late 1880s. He was a classmate of Lamont's, of the Lamont Gallery, who was associate of Rockefeller. No, Morgan. Sorry, Morgan. And William Boyce Thompson was arguably the most important miner in America in the late 19th century. And he was devoted to the academy. In fact, when he was immensely rich and he was talking with Lamont and he'd been doing all these important things that Lamont had supposedly said to him, what else would you like in your life, William? They were good friends. He said, I'd like to be a trustee of Phillips Exeter Academy. And of course, Lamont said, I think we can make that happen, which of course he did. And there was a letter which, prior to this, Lewis Perry, there's no endowment at this time. This is the early aughts. Lewis Perry becomes principal in 1914. 3 months after he's made principal, the Academy building burns down. They'd have no money. So he sends William Boyce Thompson, a letter. I've seen the letter. I had to give a talk when they dedicated the field house. And the night before, there was a big dinner with all the donors and the trustees. And they said, somebody's got to talk about Thompson. Let's have Herney do it. So I gave this talk. So I learned about this stuff. It was great fun to do. But there's this letter. Lewis Perry says, these are 6 items that would be immensely important to the school if you could do. And one was a science building, and one was money for the for the faculty, a dormitory, and I can't remember what the whole six were. Thompson writes back and says, "Would you please itemize the first five for me in terms of how much money they would cost?" He sends back the letter, and Thompson says, "I'll pay for the first five." And then later on, they want to build an endowment, and Thompson says, "Okay, I'll chip in $1 million," which in this day's currency would be what, 25 million, that he just said, I'll just write the check. So he was enormously important in building the school, and in making it financially viable. It's wonderful that the three people who gave enough money to the new field house did have naming rights. All three of them said, no, we'll keep the Thompson name on the field house, which is terrific, which is also appropriate, as I said at the dinner, that the people who could have put their name on it are anonymous, and we leave Thompson's name on because when William Boyce Thompson died, the last paragraph of his obituary in the New York Times was, after citing all the money that he had given away, it said, "Of course, we will never know the extent of Mr. Thompson's generosity because most of the time he liked to give his gifts anonymously. So we don't know where they went."
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And I didn't realize that Exeter didn't really sort of have the beginnings of its now very substantial and formidable and very important endowment. Um, Sort of that didn't even happen until around the 1914, 1915.
Didn't even start until then.
I see.
There were times in the late 19th century where they were in debt. I mean, they couldn't pay their bills. It was pretty grim. Now, since you're on the endowment, it begins then. I mean, they start. They had a Christmas fund, and they would add to it, but it was incremental all through the 20th century. When I became director of admissions, halfway through the year, you don't know this, but in 79, 80, there was a real plunge, the oil crisis and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I was told I had to cut my budget because the endowment had dropped. The endowment then was $39 million.
Is that right?
Think about that. 1980, it's 39 million. Now it's 1.5 billion. But think of the growth of that's how, I mean, 39 million was not a whole lot of money, but it still was maybe one of the richest schools in the country. But
Right.
now it's,
Well, one of the things that strikes me about Exeter is the best development organization, right, in the country, and advancement, institutional advancement,
yeah,
um, and also the culture, right? I think a lot of it is the culture as well, of generations of Exonians, and probably even I'm going to say going back to Harkness, 1930. I didn't realize until you told me about Thompson how big a deal Thompson was on the Order of Harkness. Probably big,
absolutely.
right? Probably.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, that's amazing. That's really amazing. And so
Yeah.
that,
Those two probably gave, not probably, they gave more money in the 20th century in terms of dollars, prorated over time than any other two men. Thompson's or Harkness's gift was over 5 million. The interesting thing was because it was done during the Depression, you probably know this, they had budgeted it, but because everything was so cheap, labor and everything else, that the school wound up sending him back
oh no,
money that they hadn't spent.
okay. Too bad they can't get it back. It would have
Yeah, they wouldn't do
on the
that today, I don't think.
But so, okay, last thing on this, because there's so much more I want to ask you about. Last thing on this. If the origins of the endowment are around the 1914-15 timeframe, then how did they build all this stuff? Like Abbott was in the 1850s, the first dorm, right? I lived in Webster. That was built, I think, in 1912. Dunbar was around the same time. All the dorms over by the Academy building, I think like Seoul, Peabody, all of those buildings to the side of the Academy building, all that stuff was built in the 1800s, right? How did they do all that?
Well, actually, by the only buildings that were built in the 19th century before the 20th century were uh, probably Abbott, Seoul, I think Dunbar and Peabody, and that might have been it.
I
But
see.
they would have simply raised enough money just to build those buildings. They would have taken out money, they would have taken out a loan and gifts from the academy and some. I mean, discovered that the going back to Lincoln, Abe paid for Robert's tuition $24 a year.
Yeah.
But so from some tuition monies and gifts, the Lamonts were giving money, people like that were giving some money, but they had no real um, bank account that they could draw on
Amazing.
to help. It was meeting every budget every year.
Really, that's so interesting. So, Jack, so we, travel through the early 20th century and into the sort of last half of the 20th century, and you're there from 68 through the 70s, which sounds very tumultuous as it was across all of the United States then. And then you get into the 80s. And so I didn't know you had resigned and then came back. That's actually very interesting. So you were here for about 10 years or so, and then you left to go to DC. Mark Nofri, who you may remember.
Of course, I remember Mark Nofri. You can't
Yeah,
forget Mark.
of course not. Another 4 year senior. So Mark wants to know, what is this love story, if you feel like telling us, since tomorrow's Valentine's Day as well, between Sue and Jack? And he's like, I never really knew anything about that. I'm so curious. Like, and I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but he's like, I'd actually be interested to hear how he and Sue met, how they got to Exeter. I don't know much about his backstory.
Well, it is appropriate for Valentine's Day, I suppose.
Okay.
I still remember the moment I first saw her, interestingly. I was walking on Front Street toward the gates that go over to the Academy building in Peabody, there on that side of the street. She was walking in front of what is the library now, and it was the summer of 69, 70, I guess it was. And she was walking with somebody else, and I was walking with somebody, and I said, "Who's that over there?" And I was pointing to her. I said, "Oh, she works in the summer school." I said, "Oh, really?" And so I found out what her name was and asked her out on a date. I remember Charlie Terry. Was Charlie Terry still teaching when you were
I
here?
think he was just finishing up, and he had written a book about boarding education. And
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, Charlie and Betty Terry invited us to dinner. I think that was the first time we were ever at a dinner together. They invited us separately because we weren't a couple at the time, but we went to this dinner. And then we started dating. It was a little difficult because she came full time in 72, just when I left to take a leave to work in Senator McIntyre's campaign in the first semester of the fall of 72, which he was reelected. Then I immediately went to Washington for the whole, and we were on semesters then for the whole second semester. So dating was not so easy. And then I think I met her parents that summer or the next summer or something like that. And we continued to date. And she would fly down for when I was in Washington, when I left in 76, she would fly down. She brought the cat one time. The girls in the dorm gave her a cat. She brought a cat to my apartment. So we were sort of living together, not on campus. The whole time on campus, we were very good about being appropriate.
of course of
Yeah,
course.
I won't tell you what we did off campus, of course, but
That is so cute. So basically, you're walking down Front Street, and then all of a sudden, the heavens opened up and the sun shined, and you were able
sort of
to.
like it. Yeah.
That sounds great. That's awesome. Excellent. So did the Terrys try to hook you up? Was that like the
Well,
way
I
they were?
think they were trying to be doing their part to say
Okay.
these are two nice young people, and
Yeah.
maybe we can put them together.
How fun. How cool. That's great. What dorm was she living in?
Susan, she was one of the first five who was hired, women, and because she was an administrator, I don't know what she was considered to be uh, the type who could run a dorm. Every time a dorm became a girls' dorm, she became the head of the dorm.
Is that right?
So she was in when Seoul became went from boys where I was to girls. She was head of that. I guess she was head of Dunbar. Anyway, she kept moving around. She wound up in Langdell in about 76. And that's when the cat was brought to her door by the girls in the dorm. This
Yeah.
kitten, that is, which then came to Washington on her
Nice.
vacations with her
That's so
to
great.
see me. And she was in Langdell when we were married, and we stayed there. And then we left in '83 to a house in outside of town.
That's amazing. So what did you like or not so much like about being a dorm like faculty person with all these kids around you? Because it sounds like you did that for about 13 or 14 years, right?
Oh, I did 10. Yeah, well, actually, when I came back, I guess you had that. Although when I came back, she was doing the dorm duty. I didn't have any dorm duty because I was doing the fundraising for 1 year, and then I became director of admissions, and they didn't give me dorm responsibility. But we were living in Langdell. I loved it. I mean, it was. It was got to be difficult at times. I mean, your door was always open and that sort of thing. But it was okay. I mean, that's what boarding school life is like. I will tell you that when I was director of admissions, I said to the dean of faculty, I said, I know everybody in the school. I know there's nobody who knows the student body more thoroughly than I did because I at minimal, and I would try to memorize the names of every kid before they came. Every kid would send a little picture of themselves on a card, and on the back was their name. And Susan and I would drive from Agunquit, where we were in the summer, to our offices, and she would drive, and I would memorize the face, and then I'd turn it over. So when a kid came to school, I could call them by their first name or first and last name, even though I hadn't met them, hadn't interviewed them. So I said to the dean of faculty, I know everybody this much, but I want to know the kids better, so I want to do dorm duty. In those days, they had no dorm affiliates. It was just the people who lived in the dorms. They said, well, I'll see if I can find a dorm head, which would allow you to come and do dorm duty. So I started in 82 or 83 doing dorm duty, one night a week in a dorm. And that's how I got to know so many in the class of 92, by the way, because I was in Main Street. And that group, as we all know, is notorious.
Yes.
No free among them.
Yes.
But they great group. And so doing dorm duty one night a week was a piece of cake. And I remember even um, in the aughts when we were after I was dean of faculty and we built a house in Kensington, and I'd drive into town to go do dorm duty and thinking, why am I doing this? I don't need to do it, you know? But then I'd be driving home thinking, God, I'm glad I did that. That was so much fun because you'd sit there and kids would come in and be kids. And it was very refreshing, actually.
Do you think it's kept you really young? Because when I see you now, I was like, wow, he's the same as I remember him. As spry and as jovial and energized and,
You just have to realize that all of us were old when you first met us, and we're just a little older.
okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, I would think that being around so many great kids too is very,
Oh, it really, it's, I still love it. I go to the gym to work out 4 days a week, and I hope some students are going to be in there so I can chat them up.
yeah. Yeah. They must love you. So, okay. So, like, I'm so interested in this. So, then when did you become the director of admissions?
I did a year plus of working on the Third Century Fund, which is great fun following all over the country. I was in charge of major gifts,
Wow.
which in those days, that was 5,000 to 25,000, which now is a lot more. But so I would run campaigns. The first I did Minneapolis, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Chicago. Then I did Florida. Then I did Texas. Then I did New
Nice.
York, which was huge.
Right.
But it was meeting alums, putting together a team, and having a big dinner where Steve Kurtz would come speak about the need for a lot of money.
I didn't know
And
that you were in advancement like that. So you were and like, did we even have like a formal office at that point, or were you the person that kind of
no,
started it?
this was on the third floor of Jeremiah Smith. It was one guy was the chair of the campaign, Norm Hess. I was an assistant, and then I can't remember if there was another one, or maybe
Right.
it's just the two of us who,
Is that right?
yeah, but then they hired consultants. This guy John Taylor, who was absolutely wonderful, and he would say, "Here's what you do," and he would provide the book and so on. So I'd go meet Bob Story in Cleveland and say, "We'd like you to be chair." He'd say, "Sure." I'd say, "Here's what you have to do. You have to put together a committee. You have to send out an invitation. You have to host a dinner. Steve Kurz is going to come out and give a talk. And you invite all the people." He was given a list, actually, the Academy had drawn up of all the people who we think can give between $5,000 and $25,000 in the Cleveland area. And he'd invite them to a dinner. Steve would give the talk, and then we'd hit them up to see if they'd give the money. So each city, we had to organize that kind of team. So that's what I did.
Incredible. So
And
you
then,
went, yeah.
pardon?
No, no, go ahead.
Yeah, and then I remember I was sitting in my office. I had a wonderful little office. I had a view of the academic quad, and Steve Kurtz came in and closed the door behind him. I thought, "Oh, what's this?" And I knew the director of admissions was leaving. It had been announced that Lou Hithrow was going to move to the science building, and I was thinking, I wonder who's going to have to take that job. God, that'd be awful. And Steve Kurtz closed the door behind him and sat down in the chair. And he said, "I'd like you to be the next director of admissions." I thought, what? So I said I would. And actually, it was great fun. I enjoyed it very much. So
Amazing. Of all the positions you've had, which one did you enjoy the most?
teaching, but certainly director of admissions was a great, I mean, of the administrative positions, I was certainly beats being dean of faculty, I'll tell you.
Really? Okay.
Not even close. Not even close. Yeah.
I see. Contentious bunch, I would think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And you have to tell your colleagues essentially what to do and scold them sometimes. And that's not easy.
I see. I see. So from teaching to development and advancement and fundraising to admissions and then to dean of faculty after that.
Well,
And that,
then I went back into the classroom
okay.
when you guys were there
Yeah.
and was teaching you guys. I have all your grade books if you want to know what your friends got for grade. Um, and then was chair of the department from 92 to 95. And then Kendra, same thing. I remember exactly where I was walking when we were walking to the athletic fields for some event. Oh, it was the end of school faculty picnic. And we were walking to it, and she said, "I'm going to announce in the fall a search for the dean of faculty, but actually, I want you to be the dean of faculty. So there'll be a search, but would you be the dean of faculty?" So that was 95. And then, so I become dean of faculty in the fall of 95. And about 3 weeks in, I walk into her office. She says, "By the way, I'm resigning
Yeah.
next year." What?
Yeah.
So now I've got to go through a new principal.
Wow. She was great. I worked a lot with her actually, and she was. I mean, I think that
She was
was a
great.
big inflection point, right, for Exeter.
Huge.
Exeter now versus backwards, sort of looking, like, how do you feel it's changed? Kendra being the first woman principal. Previous to that, Kurtz was there to try to lighten it up. So the old Exeter started going away, and sort of this new Exeter began to emerge, a kinder, gentler. But even when I was there, 88, there was a huge amount of hazing. There was a huge amount of difficulty. It was not a particularly easy or fun sort of place sometimes. And a lot of the folks that I talked to in class of 92 have very mixed feelings about it still. But then I look at it now, and the picture I get is this school that has continued on the multicultural trajectory, continued on the kinder, gentler track, become more diverse, become more aware of different types of folks from all different kinds of walks of life and orientations and so forth. So it seems like a completely different place even now from when I was there or when we were all there.
Yeah, I think, um, okay, probably. But from my perspective, 92 is much more like 2025 than 92 is to 1968. Those are very different schools. Okay, I'm sure beneath the surface today, you'll find kids who have found hazing issues. Perhaps I think we certainly are better at that. I remember when in the 90s we had a rather bad case involving our dorm about hazing that was just after you guys left, but it was bad. I still remember the dorm meeting with the kids, trying to get them to see that what they were doing in bringing kids into the dorm was not the way to do it. And hopefully that doesn't happen anymore. But I don't know. I remember about when you were there, I think Webster Hall was a boys' dorm that had the bench out front. And it was
Yes.
very difficult for girls
Yeah.
to walk past that bench often.
Yes.
And I remember Susan had to talk with the faculty in that dorm about, what's happening there, and this is not going to continue. This is not right. But it was difficult. So, um,
That's a notorious thing, actually. I walked into that in 1988. It had been going on for a few years, I think.
yeah,
And it was something I definitely dealt with. All of us did. By the time we were done, I'm happy to say, I think that went away. By the time we were upperclassmen,
hmm
we didn't condone that.
yeah. Oh,
I hope
good.
I hope it got better.
I think I think you're right about the diversity has even expanded. We now are need blind at admissions, as you probably know, which, there are two schools in the country that are, or three maybe, which is extraordinary. I can't tell you how that would have made my job as director of admissions so much better. I'll tell you one way, though, that I think the school is worse off.
Hmm.
I hate to say it, parent involvement.
Is that right? Tell us more.
You'd never, I never, as dean of faculty, director of admissions, had a parent come and think they could tell me what to do. Now, the faculty is like institutions all over. Parents think and you can understand they're paying a lot of money for their kids. So why wouldn't they get what I want to have happen?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
because you don't know enough about what should happen about your kid to tell you the truth. You can't say that to a parent now. And the pressure on the faculty from outside influences, we never had to worry about that. You were so insulated from any parental involvement. It was piece of cake. And now you hear from my colleagues about parents saying, my kid got a B plus. This is terrible.
Is
You've
that
ruined his life.
right? Okay.
There's a lot of that. And I hope none of the news who are now parents are that way. I know one who's not, by the way, because I know her kid. I'll just mention his name, Dylan. That's all I'll
Yes,
say.
we can all guess who that is.
Yeah.
Good job, Katerina. Good job. Now, I guess the question is why is that happened? Why has that happened? And by like around what time do you think that started to change?
I think it's a cultural thing. I think it's happened. It's happened nationwide. There's no school who's not been subject to the same pressures. I mean, people have always paid a lot of money, so it's not just that. I mean, the people in the 50s and 60s and the 70s when I was teaching, their tuition they thought was a lot of money, but they didn't feel entitled to, lambaste the faculty or whatever. It's an interesting question. I think let's face it, the in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a kid didn't necessarily get into the school they wanted to go, but they were pretty assured they were going to get a very good education and so on. Okay. Now, when I do, and I still, since I teach every spring, I write college recommendations. I wrote one, I'm writing one this year for a kid I had last year, 19 schools,
19 prep schools or 19 colleges?
19 colleges.
God, really?
And 15 is not unusual, and this has been going on for some time. So the pressure on kids with the college stuff is much greater. Um,
All right.
here are the phrase, you probably heard this a million times. In the 80s, it began uh, uh, a movement among parents to become helicopter parents.
Hmm.
You've heard that, right?
Of course, yeah.
That's way beyond now that. We don't call anybody a helicopter parent. We call them snowplow parents.
Is that so?
You haven't heard that?
Never heard that. No, no, no. I haven't.
Because they want to move everything out of the way of their child. Not just hover and find out what they're doing, but clear the road for them.
Hmm.
I can't, and the term snowplow parents has been around for a decade.
I see.
So it's been back that long.
I wonder if you think it's because of the technology being so integrated into life now, and so the
That's
kids and the
that's a
parents
good point.
talk all
I
the
mean,
time.
when a kid could only go down to the basement of such and such a hall and call from a phone about their parents and let them know what's happening. Now the parent looks, and I've heard this, emails the kid saying, "What'd you have for breakfast? I saw what's on the menu. Is that all you had?" The intrusion of the parents through technology in the life of the kid goes both ways. Contact the parent, but the parent can contact the kid, and the parent can contact the teacher much easier than it used to be. So that's part of it, certainly.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a very different Exeter. We do have some parents of current Exonians in our class, and that's a very interesting conversation topic that we're going to be taking up in this podcast, actually, in a future episode. So that is definitely, on our minds. That
I wonder how I can get a list of those people.
I would love. That's a great idea. I'm not sure how, but I at least informally we can post to the Facebook group and figure it out.
The
There's a
the reason I ask is it's been great for me to know Dylan,
right.
and because want to know kids. And I was teaching 2 years ago, I guess it was, or 3 years ago. And I went into the class. No, it was 2 years ago when this guy quit. We had a guy quit. So I took over May 1st. In my first class, I'm sitting there and this kid's sitting next to me. We go around the table and introduce ourselves. And at the end of he stands up and he says, by the way, did you ever know a student by the name of Sabrina? I said, Sabrina Kivitz. He said, that's my mom. That's
My
my mom.
God. Yeah. Okay.
So we became great buddies. It was terrific.
Yeah. Gabby Kivitz is out here in San Francisco. So we see her from time to time. I think Sabrina must be in New York if I remember. But yeah, I mean, like I'd like to think that at least one of my two daughters will come to Exeter. I'm not sure. I've given up designs on those kinds of ideas now, having become a little bit more of a mature parent, trying to like let them be who they are and not like try to project my stuff onto them. So if it makes sense and it works out, maybe down the road that'll be an option. But I think a lot of our class, I got married pretty late. I was about 40 when I got married. I had my kids in my early 40s, so they're only 7 and 10 right now. A lot of us did what a lot of us had kids in our late 20s, early 30s, and so those kids are just finishing up high school or starting college, and in some cases even out. So it has been amazing to kind of watch those those kids come and go through Exeter and have a very different kind of an experience. But to me, what strikes me about it is mostly the technology um, integration into our daily digit, like our lives, just is so different because it's like it just allows like real time contact 24 hours a day in a wholly different kind of place. I would tell you though that the whole digital revolution that we're talking about, since it does have some negative aspects to it, social media in some ways is like the new tobacco, right? And and you and I were talking about this, right? That Jonathan Haidt wrote this book called The Anxious Generation.
Oh yeah, the whole faculty read it this year.
Good, I'm glad, because beginning in 2012 or so, with the hockey sticking of mobile smartphones being in everybody's hands and social media taking off, and I think this was counted back to 2014 actually. 2012 is when I believe Facebook IPO'd. So then you just see this massive increase in childhood depression
Yes, yes,
corresponding to that, particularly around young girls. And so if you can imagine like the hazing that we all kind of dealt with in the hallways, or bullying that takes place in
yes,
American high schools, right? And then that's amplified 100x, right, on a social media platform where
absolutely.
kids are being so cruel to each other. And they're only seeing this like little sliver, right, of an individual. So it's very challenging. And we're not going to give our kids smartphones till they're probably in eighth grade at the earliest, maybe ninth,
Good
which is
idea.
that's the main recommendation these days. There's a lot of questions about that right now. It does strike me that your time at Exeter has spanned all these different eras and all these different, not just sort of political and social and cultural moments, but also moments in which education and pedagogy has changed, right? Or the participation of parents have changed. One really important thing I want to make sure we talk about before we run, and I again appreciate you staying on for so long, and I know everybody's going to love hearing this and watching this. Everybody's excited. In fact, I got to make sure I double check that there aren't more questions that had come in for you. But Harkness, what is the significance of Harkness for you, Jack? One question that came in from Ian Crew was that he experienced Harkness classes as we all did as a student, but he'd love to know how one goes about being a Harkness teacher and running a class, and would love to know a little bit about how that's done.
The I think most important skill, frankly, that Harkness teaches is not when might. It's interesting, to go back to Daniel Webster. He had to take a class in declamation, and he wasn't very good at it. The thought being that being able to speak well is going to get you somewhere. One of the most important skills, if not the most important skill of the Harkness class, is listening. And unfortunately, how few people are good at it. And I think that's hugely important from a teacher's point of view. You have to be a good listener. And that's one thing. With a new group of students, particularly who aren't used to a Harkness class, you also have to be comfortable with silence and let it let it sit there and germinate. um, and something's going to happen. So those are two things I think that are important. Certainly, we all would talk about. Remember, I mentioned going up to the department room a lot. We would talk about teaching and talk about how, geez, I just had this class on the Kansas Nebraska Act. It was a disaster. What did you do with it? And you talk about what question did you ask and that sort of thing. And you'd see new teachers come in, you'd be evaluating them, and they'd have a list of 30 questions. We say, no, that's not how you do it. You start with one and see where the class is going to take it. Another secret, I would guess, is to have an idea of where you want to go and what you want to cover, but let those silences and the talking in response to the first question lead you on a path to get to where you want to go, letting the students germinate ideas and that sort of thing. But also, I mean, I guess the fourth thing, if I'm up to three or four now, one thing was to be a referee because the students aren't going to direct conversation much because one student has a great idea and two or three people respond to it, and then another one wants to say, "Well, I have another idea," and you got to say, "No, wait a minute, we haven't finished with that idea yet." So put that aside for a second, and so there is this bit of being an orchestra leader of the voices, so that there is some sort of harmony there.
Hmm.
I guess those are
That's
some of
so
the.
cool. I mean, that is absolutely the defining characteristic of an Exeter education. By all, by I think any Exonian would agree, Harkness is really such a distinguishing characteristic and it's really special. Question though, do you think it's relevant still, especially in this new era of technology, or that it's like in any way substantially different?
Well, I'd like to think it's more important than ever. And I'll tell you, I think some Exeter people I know. I had a kid 5 years ago now, Benj Cohen, who has started his own business, and he's a wonderful guy. And we had lunch in Cambridge, and he was talking about during COVID, it was very difficult, obviously, and everybody went to their homes and they couldn't come back. And I said, "So is it better now?" And he said, "Oh yeah, I require them to come into the office at least 3 days a week." I said, "Really? Why?" And he said, "Well, it's Harkness. I mean, that's how ideas are generated, is with people, not a machine. And you can have conversations on a machine, but it's not the same as being in the same room with people and having a conversation." So he insists on people being present for that kind of thing. But also, um, it goes back to that first skill about listening. That's best tested in a situation where you're sitting with a group of people. And God, do we need that more than ever? The ability to do that. So I think it's more vital than ever.
Yeah, yeah, I tend to agree, and that was part of why I wanted to do this project because I was very emotionally distraught by the lack of civility and the lack of willingness to listen to each other or have empathy for one another in this last election cycle, and that's part of what got me thinking. Is like, wow, we really need more Exeter in America today. We need more civility and ability to listen and hear each other out and work together,
Mm-hmm.
constructively. I would like to hope the same as well. So, Jack, thank you for such an incredibly rewarding, like amazing conversation. I feel so privileged to be able to do this with you. It's such an honor. And I just wonder before we go, you mentioned, in 2009 you retired, right? But the truth of it is you've been working quite a bit still, and I think it would be great for you to tell us all what retirement has been like for you and what you're doing and like what how you manage day to day and what you and Sue are up to and where we can find you and so on.
Well, as I said, and I've taught every year since I retired, except two, and that was right after COVID. I did teach the COVID
spring when it was all on Zoom, which was something. And then I didn't want to do it after that because they still weren't coming back. So I've done that, and that's taken a lot of time. We travel a lot, which is great. I'm on boards in the community, a library board, Exeter Lit Fest board, a board of a local school, Heronfield School, and so on. That's kept me busy. I've led um, alumni trips every year since I retired, actually, to either, well, actually, that's not true because I've done 10 years of trips to either World War D-Day battlefields or the Western Front World War One battlefields with alums. I'm not sure I had too many 92s on those trips. I know tour.
Yeah, I don't know that we're out on that circuit just yet, but I know that those are like very interesting and
Yeah,
engaging opportunities.
unfortunately, the school doesn't seem interested in continuing them, so I'm not doing them
Really?
this
Oh,
spring. But Tor Lundgren, by the way, your classmate, did join me in D-Day. So, and then I give talks as I did yesterday, around the community, which is great fun. I still do the Memorial Day talk at the school in front of the Korean Vietnam Memorial. I think I've done 17 of those now, which is just a little thing, but still stay involved. And as I say, go to that fabulous fitness center we have now 4 days a week, which is great. And the Emeriti have some things. I'm part of a faculty poker group, but I'm not going to
really?
go into that. Uh,
Okay.
by the way, there was in the 18th century in the Peon on the student activities page, there was a faculty poker club page.
Right.
What?
Little gambling going on.
Yeah, yeah.
I see. I see. Oh my goodness. Well, what a tremendous gift today to, be able to hear from you. Honestly, I actually have like a whole list of other things I want to ask you about. So, maybe we can do this again at another time and we could bring a few other folks on and
I'd love it. I'd love it.
do maybe a digital Harkness conversation about something that you're interested in potentially leading. Potentially, you can give us an assignment, and I promise at least half of us will actually do it. Some will
Just
show
like
up.
the old days, just like the old days.
Some of us will show up pretending to have done the reading,
Right, right, right. Well,
trying to get by.
the more time I can spend with the 92s, the better. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's great to have you as an honorary class of 1992. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here today. Thank you for letting us in to the school. Thank you very much for that. And I think, like I said, we need more Exeter. We need more civility. We need more ability to hear each other out, talk through things productively and constructively in this
well,
country.
this was great fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So let's stay in touch. And again, if anybody from the class wants to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Herney at exeter.edu. Very
Okay,
simple.
great,
Yeah.
excellent. And don't call him Mr. Herney. Call him Jack.
Yes, please, Jack. Yes.
Okay, outstanding. So great to have you today. Please give our love to Sue.
Okay, will do.
We'll see you soon, sir.
Okay, take care.
All
Bye
right.
bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.